If you have any interest in Super Nintendo RPGs, then you've likely at least heard of Live Alive, which saw a release in 1994 for the Super Famicom in Japan. It came out during what many claim is Square Enix's golden era, or rather Squaresoft back then. Live Alive came out just a year after Secret of Mana and barely 6 months after Final Fantasy VI, which are two of Square's most well-known games on the system. And then just a few months later, some little game called Chrono Trigger came out, but barely Square even remembers that game, so let's just move on. Now, unlike the rest of Square's offerings, this game never saw an official release outside of Japan until now. Nearly 3 decades later, Live Alive has been revived for the modern age with a glorious HD 2D lick of paint, the same retro modern visual style made famous by Octopath Traveler and used again in Triangle Strategy. We've had a chance to go hands-on with 4 of the game's chapters, 3 of which are playable in the recently released demo, and we can confidently say that even 28 years later, Live Alive still feels like one of the most unique RPG experiences we've ever sat down with. The immediate comparisons to Octopath Traveler are pretty apparent, from its HD 2D visuals to the multiple playable characters, but Live Alive is its entirely own beast. In the 4 chapters we've seen, each story is an entirely separate scenario. None of the playable characters from one chapter show up in another character's story, and each chapter has its own themes. Each of Live Alive's chapters is set in a different time period, and you can play them in any order you like. This means every single story has its own visuals and musical identity. Now, this was true back on the Super Famicom, and it's still true today. But maybe we shouldn't be too surprised about how ambitious this title actually is, given the pedigree of the developers. Takashi Tokita, director of the Super Famicom version and producer on the remake, went on to co-write and co-direct Chrono Trigger, that little game that we mentioned before, and Parasite Eve on the PlayStation. The battle director Nobuyuki Inoue directed the GBA darling Mother 3, and the composer Yoko Shimomura, who supervises on this stunning rearranged soundtrack, has an endless list of RPG credits from Kingdom Hearts to the Mario & Luigi RPG series, and is also working on the upcoming Mario plus Rabbids Sparks of Hope game. Now, of the 8 playable characters, we've spent time with 4 of them so far. Twilight of Edo Japan stars Obumaru, who is a shinobi who is tasked with sneaking into an enemy castle. In Imperial China, you are a kung fu master who is looking to pass on his legacy and secret technique to a protege. The Distant Future follows an adorable little spherical robot, amusingly named Cube, as they journey with a crew of humans traveling through space. And the Wild West, which is the chapter not included in the demo, features a wanted gunslinger riding into a town caught under the heel of a gang of outlaws. From what we've seen of the stories so far, they're relatively simple, amplified by the setting, the music, and most importantly, each chapter's unique gimmick. In the Edo Japan chapter, you can get around the castle by either using Obumaru's exclusive skill, which allows him to blend into the environment and go unnoticed, or you can fight every single enemy you come across. In the Distant Future, however, from what we've played so far, there's no combat. Instead, you simply explore your ship and solve a mystery with the help of your crewmates. Of the 4 chapters we've played, Imperial China feels the most like a traditional RPG, as you bring 3 potential successors back to train them up, and then take them on in one-on-one fights. The Wild West has some combat, but you spend most of your time exploring the town of Success and collecting and laying out traps to stop the outlaw gang from terrorizing people. Even if we knew that these chapters would play differently, we were still surprised by the variety in just this handful of narratives, and the small degree of flexibility, particularly because this is, after all, an RPG from 1994, and we haven't seen anything really like it since. One constant element in the game is the combat, which, so far, is the same in every chapter where it's present. Live Alive has already torn up the 90s JRPG rulebook in terms of structure, and its combat also twists the known formula around as well. Battles are turn-based, but instead of lining your characters up in a row, you fight on a 7x7 grid. Once a character's charge gauge, which is kind of like the ATB gauge introduced in Final Fantasy IV, has filled up, you can move them around the grid and select what your next move will be. Watching the enemy's charge gauge and exploiting their weaknesses, which you can view in battle at will, is key to winning. When you select a skill, whether it's offensive or defensive, you will see the grid light up in certain spots around you, showing the skill's area of effect. This means that some attacks you can use on enemies if you're a few squares away from them, or others only work if you're standing diagonally to them. Now, while we didn't have a problem with many of the game's fights early in these chapters, some, such as Orochimaru's, can pose a challenge if you're not used to the system at play. This is perhaps the area that may take the most getting used to for some, and where the game shows many of its classic RPG trappings. However, this isn't an RPG dominated by combat, and from what we've played, every chapter feels appropriately scaled. We haven't had to grind early on whatsoever. Aside from what we mentioned with Orochimaru plus a boss in Sundown's chapter, each of which will vary in challenge depending on how you tackle their stories, Live A Live feels more about experimenting with structure and flexibility than its contemporary Super Famicom RPG siblings. The demo for the game gives you a nice flavor of just what to expect from Live A Live, and our time with the additional Wild West chapter proves early on that this is an RPG that deserves to be remembered for its sheer uniqueness. This HD 2D remake is faithful to the Super Famicom release so far, so don't expect any major changes, but with its beautiful look and sound coupled with a distinctive structure, it's a curiosity that we're very glad to see making a comeback, and a Western debut. Now, if you'd like, you can head over to nintendolife.com, we'll have links in the description down below, where we have plenty more Live A Live coverage. Now, I've been fortunate enough to go hands-on with the game as well. I believe I've played just about as much as Alana, and I have a few things that I'd like to mention as well. Now, part of my feelings on this may come down to the fact that I personally just have not played a ton of Octopath Traveler or Triangle Strategy. I have played both of them, but never made it more than 5 or 10 hours, I would say. And while I really loved the graphical style of those games, there were moments in Live A Live where I was in sheer awe. I was captivated. The depth of field effects paired with the incredible lighting and detail in the sprite work, plus the fact that you will see these 3D models with sprite work on them, and they blend so well in the environments. It really looks like you're looking at a kind of like a Lego set. I think it was the Edo, Japan chapter that really struck me. You're exploring this ancient castle at night, and there's candles, and the moonlight also will happen to light the outside, the exterior of the buildings. If you're at all remotely interested in this game, I highly recommend downloading the demo. Give it a shot. It will give you an incredible taste of what this game has to offer. I really haven't played more than what we discussed in this video so far, so I can't say beyond that, but it's easy to say that this game is a visual treat. And the absolute attention to detail as well in the Wild West area when you're roaming around outside. You can actually see tracks from what I'm assuming are like horse-drawn carriages in the dirt on the ground, leading up to the different doorways or maybe a stall where a horse would park. And simple little details like this will come up over and over again, and you might not catch all of them, but when you do, it's really special. But I think my favorite thing about this game so far, and I can't speak for the whole game yet, obviously, but the big reason that I personally play RPGs is to invest myself into the stories, to feel like somebody else. You know, I'm all there for a bit of drama or suspense. And it feels like, from what we've played with Live A Live so far, that you get all of that, along with the turn-based RPG gameplay that a lot of people like, without the expected grind that an RPG normally comes with. Now, kind of like Alana alluded to in her preview, depending on how you play the Orochimaru section, you may not be super strong to be able to take down certain enemies, certain secret bosses. There's lots of little goodies to find in that chapter in specific from what I've seen so far. But beyond that, these chapters feel like you can sort of check into them and check out, almost like watching a movie or a TV show. For someone who's a fan of RPGs and doesn't have 100 hours to toss at a game, you could just start up a new chapter every week or every month or something like that if you don't have a lot of time, and you might feel satisfied. Now, we'll have our full thoughts for you on that once the game actually releases later this month, but I think it's easy to say that we're both incredibly excited to see what else this game has to offer. So of course, feel free to let us know in the comments down below your thoughts on Live Alive. Have you tried out the demo? Are you holding off to pick up the full game later this month? Let us know. And of course, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos like this, like our Live Alive review when that goes up later this month, be sure to utilize that subscribe button because it got a Western release. Fancy that. And then ring that notification bell to be notified when that review goes up later. Thank you all so much for watching, and thank you to Alana for taking the time to write up this preview for us. I'm Zion from Nintendo Life, stay safe out there, and we will see you all next time.